It's the end of the day with Ray. Hello, my friends. Well, folks, today we're going to jump on that gigantic, sharp, interactive board. I want to share my thoughts on Phantom shares. The way I decided to do this is I picked 3 mega dealers. 2 of these mega dealers are backed by private equity. 1 of the mega dealers is backed by a BDC. And folks, at the end of the day, I wanted to look at these 3 organizations and then ask you all a question. If these organizations offered Phantom shares, which one would you bet on for a payout? Another question I want to ask you is this. How much compensation would you forego to acquire the Phantom shares? I mean, if they're just going to give you the Phantom shares, who the hell cares? I mean, take them and hope it all works out one day. But if you're giving up compensation, if you're getting Phantom shares in lieu of a bonus, then you're actually paying for them. How much would you be willing to pay for the Phantom shares if any of these organizations offered them? And folks, I want to start out by saying this. I have no idea if Dex Imaging has Phantom shares. I have no idea if Ubeo has Phantom shares. I'm pretty strong in my belief that Visual Edge IT does have Phantom shares. But the other 2, I can't substantiate that. But folks, when I think about these organizations that you see here on the Sharp Interactive board, let's start out with Ares Capital and Visual Edge. You know, Visual Edge IT and Ares Capital got together in 2017. They brought in Insignia Capital as a first out lender in 2023. When I think about Ubeo, they got together with Centennial in 2018. They brought in a secondary lender, Churchill, in 2022. You know, and folks, these are long investments. So, you know, if you started with Visual Edge IT and you're in the 2017 time frame, did you get any Phantom shares, and when did you think they would pay out? What did you think the value of those Phantom shares would be worth today, nearly 9 years later? And the same question would go for Ubeo. You know, Dex Imaging, they're the new kids on the block. I mean, they left Staples, got together with Gambit in 2024. But, you know, when I think about Dex Imaging has made some pretty boisterous goals out there. And I don't know if they've reached those goals. And what I read makes me question that they didn't reach those goals, right? And so, ladies and gentlemen, the way I did this is I put together a scorecard. I'm going to share some thoughts on each organization, and then I'm going to share their score. And I'm going to score them on funding stewardship. How do I see them relating to their funding, maybe relating to their revenues? How do I see the investment? You know, and I'm going to give them a 0 to a 5. They would get a 0, obviously, if they had any kind of loans at non-accrual that we could prove, or if their lender, you know, had a massive write-off that we could prove. Obviously, they would get a 0 there. Then I'm going to look at their overall leadership. Is it extremely questionable, or is it top-notch? If it's extremely, you know, questionable, obviously they get a 0. If it's top-notch, they get a 5. Then I want to look at their vision. Is their vision just pure fantasy? Well, that would be a 0. And the closer it gets to reality, the closer it gets to a 5. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's start out with Visual Edge IT. And we all know that they got together with Ares Capital back in 2017. And, you know, in 2017, on the 10K at Ares Capital, it showed an amortized cost of $56.7 million and a fair value of $59.3 million regarding Visual Edge IT. You know, is this the beginning, right? This is the beginning of what would become Ares Capital's worst loss in the third quarter of 2023. And this investment's been with Ares Capital for a while. And the question is, if you have Phantom shares in Visual Edge IT, are you being updated on the investment? I mean, what's going on? What are these shares worth today? If you've had these shares for more than 3 or 4 or 5 years and they're worth the same as they were when you started, or they're worth nothing, who's informing you of that, I guess is the question. Ladies and gentlemen, there it is, and it wasn't just me saying it, but the BDC Credit Reporter had a big story about this. October 24, 2023 is when it was dated. And they're talking about Visual Edge Technology, realized loss booked in third quarter of 2023. Ares Capital restructures its subordinate exposure to a leading IT firm and books its largest realized loss for the third quarter of 2023. Not me saying it, it's them saying it. If you look on the 10Q, dated June 30th of 2023, you can see a senior subordinate loan at 112.4 principal with an amortized cost of 87.5. And then when you look at the third quarter 10Q, you can see that senior subordinate loan gone. I mean, it's gone, right? Hence the nearly $50 million write-off. And they took a preferred position for $40.9 million. So that's telling you there was some pressure. There's some pressure between Ares Capital and Visual Edge on the loan. And again, if you had phantom shares, are you being in the loop on this? Are they bringing you in the loop as this goes along? And maybe they don't have to. Maybe their agreement they have around the phantom shares, we don't have to tell you anything. You know, the day you quit, we'll evaluate it. You know, if you're worth anything, when we sell the company, we'll pay you. If they're not, you're not getting any money. Maybe that's it. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to ask all of my media friends a question, and I point out the Canada report because I pulled this out of their magazine or their blog. But back in July of 2023, it wasn't just the Canada report; it was all the industry's media. And even some old men consultants were applauding Visual Edge IT because they got funds from Insignia Capital. And I, you know, no one in the media said, you know, no one even questioned. It's hard to imagine how you got funds when you had a loan and non-accrual with Ares Capital for over a year. No one brought that up. They just talked about how fantastic it is and Visual Edge is doing everything so great. And I questioned it. And this is where I challenged my industry media and friends, because had they questioned it, the employees that had the phantom shares, maybe they would have questioned things, right? Right? Maybe they didn't have phantom shares back then. Maybe they don't have them now. But if they did, and the industry's media and analysts were actually asking questions, wouldn't that help those people? I think it would. That's why we should do our job better. And ladies and gentlemen, where's the follow-up story? Because this was published, July of 2023? Well, it was in the third quarter, which is September of 2023, that Visual Edge had the what? Well, the largest loss for Ares Capital when they took a $50 million loss as they wiped out that senior subordinate loan and took a preferred position of $40.9 million. No follow-up story on that, other than, of course, here on the end of the day with Ray. When I think about their leadership, I question it. Of course I question it. You know, we've had a chief revenue officer leave, didn't get replaced. We've had a chief strategy officer leave and didn't get replaced. We had a CFO leave not a while back. I think they replaced that person. And I got to ask, is the CEO, the current CEO, what's his tenure? What's his tenure? And I think these are fair questions. Let's jump in there to Dex Imaging. You know, Dex Imaging, at the end of the day, the Doyles, you know, Dan Sr. is basically the godfather of roll-ups. I mean, he's the one that invented it, pretty much. They know what they're doing. They sold the company to Staples in 2019. I was excited about that. And folks, you know, when the articles came out around that in 2019, they were saying that Dex Imaging was about $300 million in revenue. You know, there was an article written in March of 2023. Let me just read this. Come right out of an E&X magazine article. Take note. Office technology community, the Doyles have laid down the gauntlet. Dex Imaging's goal is to reach $750 million in revenue through organic growth and acquisitions. The time frame, 18 months. So, I did a little math from March of 2023 to June of 2025. That's 28 months. What do we know about Dex Imaging's revenue now? Well, I mean, there's some more articles written out there. November 30th of 2024, 6-7 months ago, E&X magazine published the Elite Dealers, and they say that Dex Imaging was $495 million. That's nowhere near $750 million. Have they gained that since November of 2024? And ladies and gentlemen, I mean, you know, we've heard the leaders at Dex Imaging talking about getting to $1 billion. I'm not saying they won't get there, but I'm just saying, I think these are things we should be asking them. If we're going to let them do an interview with us and they say they want to do 7 hit, and they're talking about throwing down a gauntlet, I think when E&X re-interviewed them in November, for the November 30th, 2024, they should ask, hey, how's it going with that? How come you're not hitting that number? Because, folks, at the end of the day, even though the Dex Imaging investment is new with Gamut Partners, they still have to make this prove out, right? I wanted to show this because I just thought it was kind of humorous. As I was going through the research on today's episode, I see this article, The Staples Factor. Let me just read this to you. In early 2019, the industry was shaken by the news that Dex Imaging had been acquired by big box retailer Staples. I wanted to bring that up because if you were an end of the day with Ray audience, you weren't shaken by either one of these events. You weren't shaken by the fact that Dex Imaging got together with Gamut, left Staples, and you weren't shaken that Dex Imaging sold to Staples. because I predicted that a major mega dealer would sell to either Office Depot or Staples before it happened. There was no big surprise there. I laid out a vision of why I thought that would happen and what could happen with that. Of course, COVID happened. The vision I saw wasn't coming anywhere close to becoming reality between Dex Imaging and Staples. So then I did an episode and I talked about how Staples would in fact, leave or exit from Dex. Dex would leave Staples. And of course they got together with GAM in April of 2024 and they did that. But that was a while ago. It's over a year ago. What's going on with this? We really haven't seen any momentum. And so I just want to say this to all my industry media and friends again. There was a time when the industry's legacy media was extremely naive in understanding the massive audience of the end of the day with Ray. But maybe if the industry's media and analysts would ask better questions of all these players, we could get a little more accountability maybe. That's what I'm thinking. Ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about strategy at Dex Imaging. Dex Imaging announced that they were going to get into IT services. I did a video on it. I was kind of excited about it. And I told you why they were doing it, as far as I thought. They were doing it to raise the EBITDA. I mean, they wanted to raise a multiple of EBITDA. They sell the company. If you do an IT service, you get more money for it. So if they did have phantom shares, that would be good. They build a successful IT services, everybody gets rich. But folks, then I read an article in ENX magazine where they're interviewing the leader of Dextech, and I get horrified by the interview. I'm like, holy crap, I did do another episode. Oh my God, I don't know. I have some thoughts. I was questioning. And I still question if that's still their philosophy. Because in that interview, they were talking about delivering IT services like it was still 20 years ago, and it scared the hell out of me, to say the least. Ladies and gentlemen, let's jump in there to Ubeo, our last one. Ubeo got together with Centennial in 2018. Churchill Partner joined the club in 2022. But you think about Ubeo, when they got together with Centennial in 2018, what were they thinking? I mean, what were they thinking about the tenure of the investment? When Churchill joined in 2022, what were they thinking? Boy, 2025, we're going to sell this thing. We're going to sell it to Office Depot so they can compete with Staples. I mean, I don't know. They were thinking of something, right? They were thinking of some kind of exit strategy. If you had phantom shares in Ubeo and you got them early in the 2018 time frame, when did you think those things would be worth some money? Do you know what they're worth today? Do they share that with you? Ladies and gentlemen, it was in June of 2019 in the Key Point Intelligence article, and they were interviewing Ubeo, and Ubeo was saying that they were a $60 million business in April of 2018 when they got together with Centennial. We know that Ubeo bought a major player. They bought Ray Morgan. And folks, I saw an article in the Imaging Channel dated September 18, 2018, talking about Ray Morgan being 120 million, so you put that together with the 60 million that Ubeo already was, they're 180 million. 180 million. And they bought around 8 companies through June of 2019. And so how big were they in June of 2019? What was the real revenue, total revenue, right? Because folks, I went on their website and you could find all these companies they bought, and I think other than Ray Morgan, and I'm not going to say, this isn't to belittle any of these other companies. This is just my thinking. I'm thinking that other than Ray Morgan, almost all the acquisitions that were made by Ubeo were smaller companies, much, much, much smaller. Did they average 10 million in revenue apiece? Did they average 5 million? What is Ubeo's total revenue today? And folks, there's an article, well, it's in the ENX magazine, and it talks about Ubeo's revenue, and this is November 30th, 2024, the same magazine, the same article, where they talked about Dex revenue as part of the elite dealers of the 400 plus club. And it says that their revenue is approximately 400 million. And when I think about 400 million, and you think about all these companies they bought, I mean, these are the deals they did between 2021 and May of 2024. There's a lot of companies they're buying. And how much are these companies' revenues when they buy them? Everything that Ubeo bought, especially pre-COVID, the 2018, 2019 stuff, I mean, they should have had a decline, right? The revenues, everybody declined. Everything they buy and continue to buy, the output's declining. We know that Ubeo does some things around, document management and other things, but how big has that grown? How much of that is their revenue are they generating? Is it making up for any of the losses they might be seeing in the print business? But again, You know, if you had phantom shares in a company called Ubeo and you've had them since 2018, we're getting long in the tooth, right? Do you know what those are worth today? Does your leadership share that with you? And if he does, that's fantastic. That's fantastic, you know, because I don't believe, it really depends on the way the program's written up. I mean, you might not have any access to anything. Hey, we're giving you these phantom shares, shut the hell up. If they're worth anything, they're worth anything. But again, if they're giving them to you in lieu of compensation or a bonus, then I think you should have some more insight into what the hell's going on. Here's my scorecard, ladies and gentlemen. We'll start out with Visual Edge. We'll go across. Vision, fantasy versus reality. I'm giving it a 0. I'm giving it a 0 in that category because I've listened to the CEO of Visual Edge IT talk about their IT services, talk about how they're going to grow the company, and I don't see any of that happening. And everything that I see or listen to from this guy, I really question it, right? Overall leadership, a 0. I don't know how you replace I don't know how you get rid of your CRO and a chief strategy officer that were so important to the company, then you don't replace them. It seems to me they're having some overall leadership problems over there at Visual Edge. Funding stewardship, obviously a 0 because they did have a massive write-off and they had a loan and non-accrual with their BDC lender. Let's talk about Ubeo. Vision, I'm giving them a 3.5. And the reason I'm giving them a 3.5 is because they don't really have a vision on how to get services outside of the print field or related services. And I'm not blaming them for that. But at the end of the day, can they get a stronger multiple of their EBITDA without it? I know they do well with the document management. At least they talk about it doing well. And at the end of the day, the other thing that knocks them a little bit on their vision is, do they have the exact same vision they had back in 2018 when they got together with Centennial? Overall leadership, I'm giving them a 4. You know, I don't see any issues with the leadership over there at Ubeo. I think they're doing everything they can to continue to grow the company and do what they got to do, right? And folks, we don't see a revolving door with leadership at Ubeo, so I got to give them a 4. Funding stewardship, I'm giving them maybe a 2.5. And the only reason I'm doing that is because we don't know. First of all, I don't know any of the relationships with either Centennial or Churchill. But the reason I'm doing a 2.5, because first of all, no one would get a 5. They'd have to be paying cash for everything. There wouldn't be any lenders involved if they got a 5. But a 2.5 because they do have two lenders in there. They've ran around. They bought a lot of stuff. So, you know, how much debt do they have is very questionable, right? So if it's questionable to me, I got to give them a lower score. Let's look at our friends over here at Dex Imaging. You know, Dex Imaging, 2.5 on vision. I'm knocking them. If you start at 5, I'm knocking a 1.5 off based on the IT strategy. It really should be 2 points off, but I'm giving them a benefit of the doubt here, a 1.5. And I'm knocking a whole point off based on the revenue goal, because I don't believe they're at $750 million, let alone near $1 billion. And I'm not saying that they're not going to get there, but it's way past 18 months. Overall leadership, again, I give them a 4. I mean, it's hard to get a 5 with me. Let me just put it that way. But I'm giving them a 4 because I believe that they got pretty good leadership there, right? You don't see a revolving door too much there. And, you know, I think they probably have, I was debating whether to give them a 3. And the reason I would have gave them the 3 is because maybe Gamut's getting in the middle of the leadership. And, you know, if that's the case, they probably would get a 3. And then when I think about the funding stewardship, maybe a 4. I mean, it's the Doyles. I think they probably could have, put together enough cash out of their own pocket to take that thing back from Staples. But why would anybody do that? I wouldn't do that. So I feel pretty strong about them from a financial stewardship or funding stewardship. But folks, like I said, I don't know if Dex Imaging or Ubeo has phantom shares. Pretty sure Visual Edge IT does. But if you're in an organization that's giving you these phantom shares, you should have some insight as to what's going on in these companies. And you should be able to ask questions, and they should be able to be willing to share all this with you. And so I want to end with this. I went to the Google executive. His name's Al Overview. He's a really smart guy, works over there at Google. And I said, talk about some lawsuits around phantom shares, because, phantom shares, there could be some lawsuits. And sure enough, there was. There's all kinds of stuff you can read about it. But folks, it depends on the agreement that the employees have, with the ownership of the company and how they issue these phantom shares. And they don't really have the fiduciary responsibility in most cases that they would have to, preferred, shareholders, right? But let me just read this. Contractual and fiduciary duty issues. Phantom stock plans are typically based on contracts between the company and the employee. If the company fails to uphold the terms of the agreement, employees may sue for breach of contract. In some cases, employees may also argue that the company has a fiduciary duty to act in their best interest when it comes to their phantom stock, especially if the plan is used to reward employees for their contributions. So I want to close with this. If you're getting this stuff for nothing, who gives a crap? Take it. Who cares? I mean, you know what? Hey, I got these phantom shares. You know, throw them in a drawer somewhere. When something happens, you know, you either make money or you don't. It's irrelevant. But if you're paying for them, if you're getting them in lieu of a bonus or in lieu of compensation, then I believe, whether it's in the agreement or not, that the owners of those organizations absolutely have fiduciary responsibility. Everyone that has every single share of phantom shares. And I believe they should be open and honest with you beyond approach. I also believe that our industry's media and analysts could do a much better job as we talk to these mega dealers that are backed by private equity. We should start digging out a little more information from them. Maybe they don't want to answer the questions, but that could be the answer. Just some things to think about, my friends, because we all know this. Status quo is the killer of all that'll be invented. Don't get stuck there, and I'll see you all tomorrow.